My new book is called Musical Truth. I was writing it still at the time of last year's Open Mind conference. I finished writing it in October and it came out in February of this year. So most of this year has been spent promoting the book, doing talks and conferences and such, and a whole bunch of radio interviews. The book brings together everything that I've come to understand about the true nature of the corporate music industry, based on 5 years' worth of research. So I started out on this journey in late 2010, and I knew nothing about it. So it was a gradual learning process, and it was quite devastating for me along the way to come to certain realizations, specifically that certain people that I'd often thought of as cultural heroes and people that I'd looked up to are not necessarily as they would seem. And that process has continued, and since I finished writing the book, I've discovered that this whole dynamic goes even deeper than I'd suspected at first. And I've come to the grudging acceptance because the information, the evidence, the proof all points to this, that anyone that is placed there in the public eye in a position of prominence, whether it's a major music artist, a pop star, a musician, whether it's a Hollywood actor, whether it's a politician or so-called world leader, or whether it's some kind of cultural icon like Dr. Timothy Leary or Terence McKenna or Gordon Warson or somebody like that. They've all been placed there. They've all been given a role to fulfill. And they're all adhering to a certain agenda that's been laid out for them. And this agenda is rooted in mass mind control and social engineering and the cultivating of certain belief systems and values in the mind of the general public. So that's what these people are used for. And it's no different with so many of these prominent music artists that we've all spent our lives looking up to. It was devastating for me to come to these realizations, and I know that it's devastating to other people when they come across this information for the first time, because quite often, as the messenger of this type of stuff, you get very aggressively attacked by people who take a very defensive standpoint, and they just don't want to hear it. They don't want to hear that somebody they've looked up to as a hero or an icon could be in any way compromised, or their actions might be, directed behind the scenes. I can understand why that is a difficult process for people to come to terms with, because it was for me in so many cases. In my own individual situation, I had to reevaluate my view of Jay-Z. So I've been a hip-hop DJ for many years and a big fan of the hip-hop genre, and for the first part of that, I looked up to Jay-Z as this hugely gifted lyricist and, the voice of a generation and all that stuff. But the evidence speaks for itself. And there is so much evidence to show that Jay-Z is absolutely a product of these dark occult controllers that run the industry, and is basically a stooge and a foot soldier for, these individuals, that if anyone still can't see it, I really don't know what to tell you. So that was something that I had to come to terms with. And it is what it is. Truth is truth. People can either handle it or they can't. And they're either prepared to go wherever the truth takes them and go all the way, or they're not. They just want to cherry pick little bits. That bit sounds feasible to me, but I'm not having that bit. So, that's a process that people have to come to terms with on an individual basis. But it just comes down to the question of whether you're an open-minded truth seeker that wants truth, no matter how difficult or unsettling it might be, or you're not. You're either one thing or the other. Well, these individuals that come from these specific bloodlines, which are deemed important to the ongoing agenda, are given roles in different areas of society. So some of them are groomed as politicians. So you could think of somebody like Obama, who, whatever you might think of what he represents, I think most people would agree he's quite a polished speaker. And he's got it down to a fine art. He uses NLP, neuro-linguistic programming, to bring about certain responses in the listener, certain emotional responses. He's very good at that. He's been trained in that role. Then you have others who are groomed as Hollywood actors. So they would spend all their formative years being prepared to go into these kind of roles. And you think of people like, for instance, Johnny Depp, who has played such a broad range of characters. And he really seems to absorb himself into these roles. And you hear that about so many Hollywood actors. I mean, Heath Ledger, who played the Joker in the Batman movie, there were comments leading up to when he died about how much he had absorbed himself into the role of the Joker, to the point that it had taken over his own personality, and you didn't know where Heath Ledger, the actor, ended and the Joker, the character, began. So many of these actors just completely throw themselves into their role, and it becomes them. And you get the same thing with musicians. So again, to cite the book by Dave McGowan, Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon, looking at that counterculture scene that came out of Laurel Canyon in the mid to late 1960s, you get the story of the Doors and also the Byrds, who were two very influential groups from that era, that scene. And there are many people that were on the scene at the time that have come forward to say that these groups couldn't even play their own instruments when they first emerged. And there were session musicians that actually provided the recordings of these groups. And yet Jim Morrison himself, as lead singer of The Doors, emerged almost overnight as this fully formed rock icon. So clearly he'd undergone some kind of training to prepare him for that role. And I think it would have involved quite a number of years of getting his craft down to a fine art, because he arrived with this iconic image almost intact straight away. So in the case of these groups that can't play their own instruments, it's clear that they've been groomed for their part in the whole thing. But they've obviously not received the training that certain other individuals have, because they're very good and very convincing in their role. So I think it's decided by virtue of what families these individuals come out of, whether they're going to be put to work in the world of politics, the world of big business. You could think people like Bill Gates, Mark Zuckerberg, people like that, whether they're going to be groomed as rock stars or whether they're going to be groomed as television presenters or news anchors. You could think of Anderson Cooper, who is the son of Gloria Vanderbilt, coming from the Vanderbilt family, one of the key ones. So they're all given these different roles, and clearly some training and grooming has to take place. So I think there's probably academies and foundations and schools that these people go to, and they lock themselves away for a few years, get very, very good at their art, and then they're ready to be unleashed on the public. Well, I think there are a number of individuals that exhibit natural talent. They just seem to be born for the role, not by virtue of the bloodline that they come from, but just that's in their nature. And I would think of somebody like Bono, for instance, who, I don't particularly like Bono. I don't think he's a very pleasant character. I don't like what he represents. I don't like the company that he keeps, and I don't like what he's being used for. But I would have to accept that he's a pretty bloody good singer. And that to me seems like natural talent. So I've not uncovered anything about Bono that suggests that he comes from one of these key bloodlines. But I think he would probably be an example of one of these people that is deemed useful to the system. So they spot some raw talent there, and they realise that this person can be co-opted into the agenda and put to good use. And I think that's what happened with him, and I think there would be many other examples of people like that. We've had so many music artists and those close to them. So it's not just the artists, it's partners, girlfriends, boyfriends, family members, managers that have turned up dead in very suspicious circumstances through the decades. And often, within the rock music world, these are chalked up as suicides or overdoses. And most members of the general public seem to be content with that explanation as to why somebody has died in their 20s or 30s, way before their time. Because the music industry is seen as edgy, dangerous, full of drugs, full of alcohol, full of these fast lifestyles. And so they can get away with such a high body count by the general public just thinking, oh well, it's the way these people live their lives. Live fast, die young, it's the rock and roll lifestyle. So I think a lot of nefarious, suspicious activity lurks beneath these cover stories that they just took too many drugs, or they went a bit crazy, fried their brains on LSD and did themselves in. So I think there's so much more to know about many of these early deaths. I mean, we're coming up to, or we've just passed the 20th anniversary of the murder of Tupac. And in a few months, it'll be the 20th anniversary of the murder of the Notorious B.I.G. And both these rap artists were gunned down on two of the busiest streets in the world in front of dozens, if not hundreds of witnesses in Las Vegas and Los Angeles. So 20 years later, we're told they still can't catch who did it in both cases. And the general public seems to be content to chalk it up as, oh, well, you know, we all know what these hip-hop guys are like. They come from the ghetto. They're all about toting guns and running drugs. You live by the gun, you die by the gun. And the reason they got gunned down is because that's just the circles they moved in. So they get away with a lot in that way. People haven't asked nearly enough questions about what happened to Whitney Houston or even Michael Jackson or Prince. You know, all these deaths have been very loosely chalked up as, oh, Whitney just seems to have taken some kind of overdose, and Prince and Michael Jackson seem to have been on some meds and, you know, they overdosed on those, so that's the end of that one then. You know, people should really be asking what went on in all these cases, because it's not sufficient to just chalk it up as an overdose, too many pharmaceutical meds, you know. They get away with so much in this way, and I think it could only happen in the music industry. You know, if banking giants were dropping like flies, and if leaders of IT companies were turning up dead in bathtubs, people would be demanding more specific answers. But you can get away with it in the rock music world, it seems.